It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Natalie Isaza.
Good morning, everybody. How many of you have heard about the Shelter Standards Project? Oh, good. A lot of you. And how many of you are anxiously awaiting the release of the Shelter Standards document? Me. Just a little bit of background for those of you that don't know. We're going to talk about a little bit about the project today. It's a huge project, and so the time that I have allotted for this presentation is not going to even barely skim the surface of what this project entails. But again, the goal of this project is just to introduce what we set out to do as veterinarians working in the shelter medicine field. And, that this project has been going on for the past 2.5 years, and we're hoping that we're going to have it ready for release in early 2011. So I know that all of you guys have been expecting it for a while, and again, we are working really hard to get it out to you guys. All right, so the Shelter Standards Task Force members, as you can see, there are quite a few. We have 14 total members. Most of these members are current or former board members of the Association of Shelter Veterinarians. As you can probably see from where these people are employed, they work in a variety of positions from academia to private shelters and to industry even. And together, combined, there are several hundred years of experience working with shelters and in shelters. So it was a very diverse group, but also a very focused group, and also a very, very qualified group of people. All right, so this project was first discussed in 2001 when the ASV first formed. Are any of you, how many of you are members of the ASV? All right, so you probably know a little bit of history about the organization. It did form in 2001, and almost as soon as this organization formed, their discussion began about creating some kind of a document for shelter standards, because we recognized at that point that there was a huge disconnect between shelters all over the country and the standard of care that they provided to their animals. We kind of put that on the back burner because, again, the organization was new and we had a lot of other pressing needs that we needed to deal with. So in 2007, we kind of brought that conversation up again, and we actually got a literature search going. And in 2009, at our annual board meeting, the board members received, I think, 2 huge boxes of references that Dr. Gary Petronic had put together for us to review. And at that point, we were also tasked with sort of deciding which section we wanted to kind of take control of. And so section leaders were chosen and editors, and we tended to have 2 to 3 people working on a section, but there was an editor for each section. So this was in 2009, so in early 2009, spring 2009, we had to have our drafts in, or summer of 2009, and then we've just been editing since. And as you can imagine, it's a big project, and I'll go into what some of the topics cover. And you guys that are working in shelters or shelter veterinarians, you can probably understand the reason it's taken so long, because we really want to make sure that we get it right. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're not too prescriptive. We don't want to be dictatorial and tell shelters how to do things. But we also want to provide guidance for shelters that really need it. So hopefully, like I said, our goal is early 2011. So today's presentation, we're going to talk first about the scope and intentions of this project. We're going to talk, because I think an important part of this discussion is a history of animal sheltering. Maybe even a lot of you don't know the history of sheltering and animal protection in this country. The guiding principles for our document are the 5 freedoms, and we're going to discuss that a little bit for those of you that might not be familiar with those. And we're also going to discuss why we feel like there is a need for shelter standards. And I'm sure many of you in the audience know that there is a need, but maybe, other people don't understand why. And is there a precedent for standards? What have other organizations done to create standards for within their organization to make things better for animals? we also are going to discuss the quality of life issues versus the actual cruelty statutes that are written on many books, law books in states and across the country. And then I'm going to just briefly discuss some of the content of the standards. Again, it's such a huge document that if I attempted to get into all of it during this presentation, I wouldn't finish. So we are just going to touch on a few basic points of the document. So the scope of this project was very, very broad, and we also used the term shelter very broadly, and we wanted to reflect the wide range of organizations that and even individuals like foster homes that were caring for animals. And to that end, our intention was to develop a document that would be relevant regardless of the philosophy or mission or the size of the organization. And we wanted to actually turn things around and bring the focus back to the animal itself and the needs of that animal. So again, this document is really meant to be very broad. Anybody that is working with animals should be able to go to this document as a reference and see if they're doing things correctly or doing things to the standard that we feel should be done for our homeless companion animals. So what is the shelter today? I'm sure many of you work in a lot of these different types of sheltering situations. Of course, we have municipal animal control. That's the traditional open admission shelter that's run by county or city government. There are private humane societies, there are rescue groups, foster homes, people that foster little kittens in their home, transport groups, sanctuaries, and then there's also hospice care. So for those of you that don't know, the history of the modern animal protection and sheltering movement really began in the mid to late 1800s. And it's worth reviewing the roots, as I mentioned earlier, because the original mission is really relevant to what we're discussing today. So this man here that's pictured, you may or may not recognize him, but he was one of the fathers of the humane animal movement. This is Henry Bergh, and you may or may not know him as the founder of the ASPCA in New York City. Now, Henry Bergh was the son of a very wealthy man, and while on a trip to England, he was very privileged. He actually witnessed the beating of a carriage horse. And he had grown up in New York and lived in New York. And in New York and Europe during that time, carriage horses were used for everything from transporting goods to transporting people. And they were essentially used until they broke down. And I don't know what on this trip to England really prompted him, but he sort of had an epiphany when he saw the beating of this horse. And he decided that when he came back to the United States, he was going to make it his mission to improve the quality of life of these horses in New York. So a lot of you think, wow, that's really interesting. Here he's the founder of the ASPCA, but it actually started with carriage horses, not dogs and not cats. So when he found the ASPCA, its primary mission was to prevent cruelty to animals. And it was not involved in sheltering animals at all. In fact, Henry Bergh was very opposed to that. He felt at the time that New York, which is where he lived and where the ASPCA is, had a very, what he felt was inhumane animal control, and he did not want any part of it. He wanted his organization to be a separate humane movement that was concerned more with the prevention of cruelty. In the early days, the statutes that were written that are the foundation of many of our anti-cruelty laws, they actually were very closely allied with cruelty to children, because back then children did not have the protection that they have now. And actually Henry Bergh was very well known for the help that he gave to this orphan child that was actually beaten by a foster parent. So his emphasis was not just on animals, but it was just the prevention of suffering in general. So again, Henry Bergh did not want animal control in New York involved at all with his organization, and it was something that he adamantly opposed until his death. And unfortunately, after his death, the ASPCA chose to take up the contract of animal control with the city of New York. And it wasn't until over 100 years later that they actually separated themselves. So we're talking 1994. So for 100 years, the ASPCA was animal control in New York. And again, that was not what Henry Berg felt his humane movement should do. And he just felt that the missions of both of those groups were two very different missions, and he did not want to have any part of it. So many other humane societies, once the ASPCA came on board with animal control, decided to take up the animal control portion of a city's responsibilities. And as a result, the animal control and efforts to prevent cruelty often became merged, if not muddled. So these people were supposedly taking care and providing humane care of animals, but at the same time, they were engaged in inhumane practices of euthanasia, crowding, disease. So there was not a lot of humane care going on in some of these earlier shelters. And because the people that worked in these shelters were starting to deal with a huge number of animals in their facilities, it led to the term pet overpopulation. But increasingly, the euthanasia of surplus animals became the focus of the organizations, not actually the humane care of these animals. And so the people that worked in these shelters were not prepared to have to euthanize animals, which led to many inhumane methods of euthanasia. And if you saw in the previous slide, the big crate, that was the way they used to euthanize dogs in New York. They would put them in a big crate and lower them into the East River to drown them. So, this was, obviously today we would be, horrified that that's very inhumane, but that was routine in those days. And as you guys probably can understand too, because people worked in these shelters and were dealing with these kind of inhumane euthanasias in this crowded situation, the people that worked in shelters were often stigmatized, as they are often today as well. So the first wave of change in modern sheltering arose in response to the need to euthanize so many unwanted pets in a more humane manner and to provide respect and credibility to the individuals who struggled to support the best they could the shelters in their area. Leaders such as Phyllis Wright at HSUS were instrumental in implementing staff training, and this is a picture of Phyllis Wright. She actually had a mantra of less is more. That's LES is more, and LES stands for legislation, education, and sterilization. And this mantra guided shelters for decades, and it's actually very quite relevant today. And so she was really a pioneer in animal sheltering and actually kind of turning the focus around and putting the emphasis more on animal care and animal humane care. And she also recognized early on that the way out of pet overpopulation was sterilization. So the early advocates for shelter reform could never have probably envisioned how far we've come in the last, 30 or 40 years with animal sheltering. The success that we've had here, and you can see this is from the Maddie's Fund website, and reducing animal euthanasia is just phenomenal. And a lot of this is due to those early pioneers in animal sheltering. And also the involvement of veterinarians with shelters has changed dramatically as the decline in euthanasia numbers. And it opens the door to a new era of sheltering. And we were training more shelter veterinarians. We're demanding more humane and care for our animals in shelters, not just for shelter animals, but also for farm animals. So it's something that's driven by our communities and by the public in general. So as you can probably imagine, all of you that are shelter veterinarians, you know that the knowledge base in shelter medicine has really grown by leaps and bounds over the last 10 years. We have 2 textbooks now that are directly relevant to shelter medicine, and we have hundreds of research papers in peer-reviewed journals. There are shelter medicine training programs, as Dr. Levy mentioned, at many universities. And students are also now being trained in shelter medicine, something that was extremely, if I had thought of, when I was a vet student that I could get training like this, I would just be amazed. I mean, I'm sure most of you feel that way too. Even 15, 16, 20 years ago, the training was just not there in this field. So we really are training a lot of students now to recognize the needs of animals in shelters and also training them to be involved in this field when they graduate. Also, the field of animal behavior has contributed very significantly to our knowledge and the growing awareness of the complexity of animal minds and their needs and wants. And we also have seen a considerable growth in discussions about mental health and well-being of animals and their quality of life, which is very, very important and a huge component of animal sheltering. In the past, we've always thought, well, if they're healthy, then it's okay. But we need to realize now that part of being healthy is mental health as well as physical health. So it should be equally as important for us in shelters to provide that physical stimulation, that one-on-one contact with these animals, these ways that they can exhibit their normal behavior. That should be just as important as us giving them those vaccines when they come in and giving them those dewormers. Just putting them in a cage and letting them sit there with no interaction from other animals or or people is inhumane, and I think that we've all grown to recognize that now. As I mentioned before, society is actually now really very adamant that they want more humane care of animals. And this actually started, believe it or not, with food animal production. I'm sure a lot of you are probably aware that in Europe, that there has been huge concerns about intensive agriculture and the effects that it has on animals. There's a huge discussion in the AVMA, on the Welfare Committee now, about farrowing crates and the use of those crates in hog farms. And unfortunately, the United States actually lags really far behind many countries in the European Union with respect to these issues. And again, if society is rallying behind better treatment for animals they eat, what are their expectations for the animals that they treasure most as their family members? So we really need to understand that people are going to demand that these animals are treated humanely. So one of the changes that we've seen in society is the acknowledgement that confinement actually causes stress. So, in the past, like I mentioned before, we're just more concerned with keeping animals healthy physically. But remember that confining them is also very, very stressful. And we first recognized that with zoo animals, and you can see here there's a few animals in zoos. And if you guys have been to a zoo lately that maybe isn't that up to date with its exhibits, you can see that animals tend to pace back and forth. You can see this polar bear is pacing, the wolves pace back and forth along the fence line. So it's been acknowledged for many years in the zoo and farm settings, but only recently have we begun to recognize that confinement in shelter settings is equally deleterious to these animals. And so we know more than we ever did about the needs and wants of these animals in shelters, and we do have an obligation to put that knowledge into practice. So in order to develop a document that was relevant to a broad range of entities caring for companion animals, we actually modeled the shelter standards from along the lines of the 5 freedoms. Have all of you heard of the 5 freedoms before? Yes? No? The 5 freedoms actually originated with a report of the Technical Committee to Inquire into the Welfare of Animals. This was a United Kingdom committee, and it was issued in 1965 as the Bramble Report. And the concept was subsequently refined by the Farm Animal Welfare Council, so that actually took the form of these 5 freedoms that you see. It's since been further updated and is now the most visited page on the Farm Animal Welfare Council's website. And the principles are relevant and appropriate measures of welfare for any species, and we tried to be mindful of this when we were comprising this document. Another reason the standards are timely is the occurrence of all too many situations where those claiming to be protecting animals did them actually very great harm. And we can't undo the harm that these animals went through, but we can honor them and the lives that were lost, and we can learn from the tragedies and do everything we can to ensure that they're not repeated. So the lead animal shelter is a shelter in Las Vegas, and they actually were run by the Animal Foundation, and this was a rescue organization whose main goal was to reduce euthanasia through high volume and high volume quality spay-neuter programs. However, in 1995, they actually were awarded the Las Vegas City Animal Control contract, and then they became an open admission shelter. The problems with overcrowding and disease didn't stop them from obtaining the Clark County and North Las Vegas animal control contracts, and then they became one of the largest open admission shelters in the nation, and they really believed that they were a model shelter. So if you look at those shelter statistics, you can realize that they were anything but the model shelter that they thought they were. Nearly 60% of the animals that entered the shelter either died in their cages, were euthanized at the point of death, or were euthanized for severe illness. So they didn't euthanize any healthy animals. 41% were adopted, but 60%, almost 60%, died in their cages, were euthanized because they were ill, or euthanized because they were dying. So if you look at typical in-shelter mortality from, this is actually statistics from Virginia, you can see how far this is from actually being normal. The died in the shelter in this graph actually is less than 1% for dogs and less than 2% for cats. So the overall rate is about 1.3%. And again, this is for shelters in the state of Virginia. So this is just some images from Lead Shelter. A number of our shelter task force members actually were involved in this investigation. Drs. Hurley and Newberry graciously provided these pictures. So you can see here this kennel was just overcrowded with a lot of little dogs. It was kind of like the little dog kennel. Wasn't unusual to find cats suffering from severe respiratory disease. And this dog was kind of found moribund in his cage with diarrhea. And this was just the norm for this particular shelter. And I'm just going to read this to you. And I'm not sure if you guys can read it or not, but I think it just needs to be read out loud so you can understand the gravity. The HSUS team found serious deficits in animal health and veterinary care at Lead. Dozens of animals were dead or dying from a variety of serious illnesses. Hundreds of animals in every area of the shelter were sick. Dogs were starving due to lack of access to food and overcrowded runs, and attacks upon kennel mates were frequent. Aisleways open to the public were slick with diarrhea, vomit, and blood from sick and dying animals. Carcasses were left in cages during open hours as overwhelmed staff scrambled to keep up with removal of the bodies. Although many individual staff members expressed concern and caring for the animals, there was a nearly complete absence of training and a lack of needed supplies, which would have made humane animal care challenging even in less crowded conditions. So to me, I can't even imagine that people working in the shelter would think that this was okay. But I think that, if you're in that situation and you're living it day to day, it's almost like you maybe become blind to it or just think that that's normal. And we should all recognize that that is not normal. The HSUS team that inspected this shelter and tried to make recommendations for them, they did issue a 200-page report, and they described the deficiencies, as you can see here, in very graphic detail, including photos of dead and dying animals. And to their credit, Lead Shelter did post this report in its entirety on their website as a path towards self-repair. So the Edna Sanctuary, just another. What began as a routine follow-up on some dogs rescued from Katrina turned into one of the largest cruelty cases on record. Over 500 dogs were on the property. The dogs, still in the shipping crates they arrived in, were covered in feces and urine. Many had burns covering their paws and bodies from standing and sleeping in their urine for days, even weeks. Baxter County Sheriff John Montgomery said, "I've never seen anything like this before. The dogs had no shelter from the weather, heat of the day, or cold of the night." One of our rescuers on the scene said, "We found 2 dogs dead in trash bags and 2 dogs that have died since they were rescued from the Katrina disaster area, that died alone and in their own filth inside the crate donated by the organizations that saved them." There was no permanent shelter nor bathroom facilities on the property. There were swarms of flies everywhere, and a rising stench rolled off the grounds. HSUS headquarters took over the operation and the care of the animals. United Animal Nations Emergency Animal Rescue Service also was called in to help. So just another example. Tiger Ranch. I'm just going to read this from, because you guys probably can't read it, it's a little small. Authorities found more than 600 cats on Bruno's 29-acre property off of Bakerstown Road, including about 200 dead ones. Of the 406 found alive, many had to be euthanized or died while being transported to a makeshift shelter in Clarion County. Authorities also found 9 dogs, 8 horses, chickens, and a goat living on Bruno's property. Charges were filed involving the horses and the goat, too. Bruno faces 208 misdemeanor counts of willfully and maliciously killing, maiming, mutilating, torturing, or disfiguring a cat, and 385 summary counts of cruelly ill-treating, beating, or otherwise abusing an animal, or neglecting the animal by withholding care, food, water, clean shelter, and veterinary care. Expert witness veterinarian Dr. Becky Morrow choked back tears as she testified that painful illnesses ultimately led to the cats either dying on their own or having to be euthanized. She used words such as emaciated and agonal. A slideshow of thawed cat carcasses that were found in a deep freezer in the garage at Tiger Ranch brought many people in the courtroom to tears as Morrow described the condition of each cat. Almost every cat was described as emaciated, and they had mucus coming from their eyes and noses. Bruno's attorney argued that the cats in the freezer were never proven to be hers. 10th Life Sanctuary for Cats. This was a sanctuary that the shelter medicine team at UF was involved in. And this sanctuary was located in Clewiston, Florida. And according to its website, it described itself as dedicated to providing lifetime care to sick, unwanted, and feral cats. At one point, they were caring for over 600 cats on the property. Over a 3-day period in 2009, the UF Shelter Medicine Program led a team of veterinarians, veterinary students, and technicians in a triage operation to examine each cat. They collected forensic documentation. They tested each one for feline leukemia virus, feline immunodeficiency virus, and heartworms. They implanted microchips and treated for internal and external parasites. During this initial evaluation, 93 cats were identified by the veterinary team as having severe illness affecting quality of life. It was determined that the most humane choice for these severely ill cats was humane euthanasia. Even though infectious diseases were rampant throughout this facility and about half of the cats were feral, they were able to transfer the vast majority to other agencies. The entire humane community pulled together to create a happy ending for this sad story. The vast majority of cats who went to 10th Life died within a few years of arrival, and many of the survivors had substantial medical conditions and carried multiple infectious diseases. Some had even arrived as victims of previous cruelty and hoarding investigations. The final statistics tell a story of success and sadness. The closure of the 10th Life Sanctuary represents one of the largest cat rescues in U.S. history. A total of 110 cats were euthanized in the first days of medical triage due to critical medical illness, including 17 that were euthanized immediately following the unannounced inspection. Of the remaining 485 cats, 75 of the feral cats were euthanized when new placement options could not be found for them. This 15% euthanasia rate for the savable cats is in stark contrast to the vast majority of large-scale feline cruelty impoundments in which mass euthanasia is the most common outcome. So again, these problems are not just limited to private groups. In October of 2009, sheriff's deputies raided the City of Memphis Animal Shelter, and this was the county that actually raided the city shelter. I'll just read a little part of what this says, because I think you guys are getting the idea here. Deputies arrived at the facility and found conditions consistent with what they had been reported by a tipster. According to the search warrant, some animals have been deprived of food and water, and some dogs have been starved to the point of requiring euthanasia. So there were actually cruelty charges filed against the people that ran this shelter, as you can imagine. Toward the end of 2009, law enforcement actually executed a search warrant at the Toronto Humane Society. They arrested the president, the chief veterinarian, and 3 other staff members for animal cruelty. Investigators relayed stories of animals left to die in their cages of infectious disease, starvation, or other causes. So if you look at this graphic, this is actually data obtained by the Globe newspaper in Toronto. And this is from their chameleon data in their computers. As you can see here, there were twice as many shelter deaths as there were euthanasias. So 15%, or 1 out of every 7 animals, died in this shelter. And that's really far beyond the norm of proper animal care. More animals actually died than were euthanized, so that shouldn't be happening. Unfortunately, the sentiment that is portrayed here, this was actually the director of this shelter that said this. If you have to put a cage on top of cage as long as the animal's living, isn't it the whole thing? You can't let interior decorating get in the way. The sentiment is also very prevalent in shelters all over the country. I mean, at some point, you're trying to save so many animals, so you start stacking crates. But is that a humane way for that animal to be housed, and especially long term? I don't think it is. So again, it's also not just related to shelters and private sanctuaries, but also veterinarians can be charged with animal cruelty. You may have heard about this as early last year, where a veterinarian who was helped out at a shelter in Tennessee was videotaped euthanizing conscious, awake dogs with a cardiac stick. Again, lack of humane care also falls on the shoulder of veterinarians. You can see those last 2 instances where the shelter vet in Toronto was actually arrested for cruelty. And this veterinarian, again, was videotaped euthanizing dogs with intracardiac injection. This is an unacceptable and inhumane method of euthanasia, and that's actually according to the AVMA's own euthanasia guidelines. So in response to what he actually did, he said, "There's a difference between shelter medicine and veterinary medicine. It ain't pretty. I do a difficult job to the best of my ability." So as a veterinarian, I'm actually very, very disturbed by that, because there is no difference between veterinary medicine and shelter. It is veterinary medicine, and you shouldn't treat animals any differently because they're housed in an animal shelter or because they don't have a home. They should be treated with the dignity that they deserve. So, cruelty statutes that are on the books now in many states across the country actually contain very archaic language, and they appear to actually have been written for another place and time. And yet many of the states just adopt these statutes without really trying to refine them, and they use them as the basis for their anti-cruelty laws. So you can see the first part here where it says, whoever overdrives, overloads, drives when overloaded, overworks, tortures. That sounds like it could have been written in Henry Berg's time, and it probably was. So it makes it very difficult for us in shelters, and actually for law enforcement too, to actually look at this and say, well, is this cruelty or is this not cruelty? When you have language that's not very specific, again, it makes it really hard for people to draw that line and what is acceptable and what's not. And animal shelters, as you all know, are largely unregulated. And so the only resource that's available to most shelters and law enforcement when the care deteriorates are these cruelty statutes. And they actually fall very short of ensuring adequate and optimal care. And when considering the lead shelter, which I talked about earlier, it's important to remember that despite these animals suffering, no cruelty charges were ever filed there. The Farm Animal Welfare Council has now built upon the 5 freedoms that we talked about earlier to actually conceptualize the quality of life on a spectrum, from the high quality of life to a life not worth living. And as you can see in this slide, there may be considerable preventable suffering before a situation is actually considered cruelty under current cruelty laws. So how do we articulate these principles into the language that shelters can use and understand? The picture on the left is from a recent article that describes a renovated animal sanctuary that housed over 700 animals. And the organization in this article is described as glowing with pride, yet almost everything in this picture is a lesson in not what to do and what not to do, compared with the setting on the right. And it's from both a shelter medicine perspective as well as meeting the behavioral and mental needs of these cats. What's shown here is not just cosmetic differences. Despite vastly different resources between the two organizations pictured here, the shelter on the left could have found ways to put the 5 freedoms into practice. And that's really our hope with the whole standards document, is that we will help provide guidance for shelters to look at those 5 freedoms and see how that can be applied to their shelter. So the Farm Animal Welfare Council has begun to build on the 5 freedoms to also address the minimal acceptable treatment as the most important ethical issue relating to farm animal welfare. In addressing this, the Farm Animal Welfare Council has accepted Banner's principles, and those are: the harms of a certain degree and kind should not under any circumstances be inflicted on an animal. Any harm to an animal, even if not absolutely impermissible, nonetheless requires justification and must be outweighed by the good which is realistically sought in so treating it. And any harm which is justified by the second principle ought, however, to be minimized as far as is reasonably possible. So in writing this document, we actually have embraced the first of Banner's principles. There are certain practices we believe are simply unacceptable and must be called out. And one example would be what I illustrated earlier with a cardiac stick and a conscious animal. Another would be hosing down a cage while an animal's still inside. Another would be using carbon monoxide for euthanasia. All of these examples may seem self-evident and obvious to you, but the task force members that wrote this document have encountered these kinds of deficiencies in shelters that we've visited or worked in. And the people seeking to remedy these deficiencies have little support to fall back on. So we really want this document to be that support for people in shelters that recognize that some of the things that are going on are not humane and they need to be changed. And we want them to have a voice through this document. So ensuring well-being, I think that picture says it all. If I saw this animal in a shelter, I would not think that this poor dog is being treated humanely. So there are also more subtle problems, kind of mentioned before, stacking cages. This is a real common practice. People are trying their hardest to save as many animals, but at what cost? I mean, we're putting animals on top of animals, and we're creating an environment that just is ripe for infectious disease, and then these animals suffer because they're dying of respiratory diseases or dying of parvo. And it's just not a good situation at all. And I know it's a really hard thing because, I've worked in a shelter too, and you want to be able to save every animal that you can, but this is not an acceptable way to do it. So more subtle problems, you can see that in this particular shelter on the left, there are crates stacked in the hallways between the kennel runs. They're just trying to house as many animals as they can. And, in this instance, less is more. You really want to provide humane care, and you can't do that if you have too many animals there. And on the right, this shelter, this is disinfection of a kennel. And you can see that there's food and feces and urine on the ground. The yellow that you see in the front is the trifectant. So they just sprayed it right on top. For those of you that do cleaning and disinfections in your shelters and sanitation, you know that this is unacceptable. This isn't going to do anything. And, this is a subtle problem, but it's pervasive. It happens everywhere. So everyone would agree that the cats on the left, that's just too many cats. And that's kind of a problem that if you saw that, you would say, oh yeah, well we need to do something about that. But how about the picture on the right? I mean, people would look at that with the untrained eye and say, oh, that's great. Look at those cats. They're in a room and they have all these enrichment and they're eating and hanging out. But look how many cats are there. And if you look at these cats, and again, it's really hard to understand cat behavior and their postures and things like that. But those of us that have worked with cats for a long time recognize that none of these cats are relaxed. They're kind of got their guard up. And so is this a humane situation for them? There are too many cats in this room to humanely house them. So more severe problems. This I talked about earlier, hosing an animal hosing the cage down while the animal's still in the cage is simply unacceptable. I would actually think of that as a more severe problem if I saw that happening in a shelter. And then, you really shouldn't find dead animals in the morning. It shouldn't be like a routine thing to go through and collect the dead animals. It should be a very, very rare occurrence if it happens at all. So how can standards help? Well, we want to help establish what is required for a decent quality of life for populations of companion animals. We want to make sure that people understand that high morbidity and mortality from disease and injury is not the norm in shelters. It should not be the norm. They should be healthy animals. We want to connect the expectations of sanitation, medical care, mental and behavior well-being to acceptable sheltering, and then get rid of any notions that these essentials are frivolous or extra or cosmetic, because they're not. This is all part of animal sheltering. So do we have a precedent for standards? Are there other organizations that have created standards documents? And the answer to that is yes. So I'm just going to go real quickly through some of these just to kind of give you a background of what other organizations have done over the years to develop standards for the animals that are in their care. So all of you that are veterinarians probably recognize that the American Animal Hospital Association actually provides accreditation to veterinary hospitals, and it's a really rigorous standard that they go through. They come in and inspect the hospital and make sure everything is up to their guidelines, which are spelled out on their website. Zoos and aquariums have had standards for years and years, since the old days, when the zoos were just places with bars and no enrichment, and now it's a totally different experience for those of you that have been to a zoo lately. But zoos and aquariums have actually had these standards of care for a long time for their animals. Lab animal facilities, those of you that work in universities know that there are very strict guidelines for the care of laboratory animals, and rats and mice and guinea pigs and rabbits and all of the animals that they would use in a laboratory setting, again, have to be meticulously cared for, and they really can get in trouble with IACUC and other organizations within the university if these animals are not kept to these standards of care. Wildlife rehabilitators even have minimum standards for wildlife rehabilitation. This actually dates back to the 1980s. This document was written, and it was written by rehabilitators for rehabilitators. And actually some of these state agencies, wildlife agencies, use this when they for permitting processes. So if they're going to provide a wildlife permit for a rehabilitator, they're going to use these guidelines. The Equine Rescue and Retirement, they have guidelines that are put out by the AAEP, which is the American Association of Equine Practitioners. Exotic animal sanctuaries even have guidelines. This is the American Sanctuary Association. Catteries and kennels, of course, you guys, breeders are going to have certain guidelines for their kennels. The American Kennel Club has guidelines, the Cat Fanciers Association, and then these organizations on the left are actually Canadian organizations for essentially equivalent to the American Kennel Club and the Cat Fanciers in the United States. So what's the significance of these other standards documents? It actually demonstrates that there's a broad acceptance of the merit of the standards. So it's something that people are going to be drawn to and accept. It shows that there's considerable internal consistency across species, settings, and countries. So these guidelines that I've just showed you are actually used not just in the United States but in other parts of the world as well. But as you can see from those guidelines, none of those really apply directly to the care of unwanted, stray, or abused companion animals or the shelters that provide care for them. And it does demonstrate that there's a huge gap in providing guidance for shelters. So there's no mandate for shelters to follow these guidelines when they come out. In fact, they can ignore them if they want. However, there's precedent that other documents, that this is the Compendium of Animal Rabies Prevention, and this has been written by the National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians. This is actually it's written based on sound science and medicine, and it's actually now broadly accepted, and it's incorporated into statute or practice, and this is become parts of laws in states and communities for rabies control. So back to the Toronto shelter, there was an article in the Globe following the arrest of the director and the veterinarian and the staff of the Toronto shelter, that there was a huge lack of oversight of animal shelters. And each of these incidents that I talked about earlier brings forth a new dialogue about the lack of this oversight and the regulation of animal shelters. And we shouldn't be complacent about this anymore. We really need to take action. So the standards are, again, I'm not going to go into all of it or I'd be here all day, but this is just the overview of the content of our document. We have operational issues. We have facility design and management, population management, sanitation, medical health and physical well-being, behavioral health and mental well-being, group housing, animal handling, euthanasia, spay-neuter, animal transport, public health. So you can see it covers a wide array of topics. And again, you can probably also understand why it's taken us so long to get this document out. I do want to thank the Kenneth Scott Charitable Trust and the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals for supporting this project. And now, if you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them for you.